Okay, hi everyone. It's just past the hour, so I think we can get started. Thank you very much for joining today. Just a few housekeeping notes before we start. Welcome to this webinar that's organised by the National Open Research Forum in Ireland. And today we're focusing on the topic of FAIR data in collaboration with colleagues from the European project FAIRsFAIR. My name is Daniel Bangert. I work with NORF as National Open Research Coordinator, and I'm based at the Digital Repository of Ireland. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. As you'll notice, audience cameras are off and the microphones are muted, but we encourage participation in the event using the webinar's interactive features. During the webinar, there will be opportunities to submit your questions to today's speakers, and to do so, just type your question into the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. Please note that the chat function is enabled and you're very welcome to submit comments through the chat. However, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature. We'll also be using Mentimeter during the webinar and encourage everyone to give feedback during those interactive sections. We're recording this webinar and we'll share the link to that recording after the event. If you'd like to tweet about it, please use the hashtag OpenResearchIE, and you can also tag the NORF and FAIRsFAIR Twitter accounts. Today's webinar is part of a series from NORF on open research in Ireland, and it's also one of several national roadshows that have been organised by FAIRsFAIR. And we're really delighted to be collaborating with our colleagues from FAIRsFAIR, and we'll hear more about the project shortly. The objectives for today are to present and discuss developments related to FAIR data, firstly setting up the national context in terms of what is the state of play in relation to FAIR in Ireland, and then hear about the work that FAIRsFAIR have been doing in the European context to produce recommendations and support to foster good practices in making data fair. For NORF specifically, an objective today is to engage a broad national audience in work that's underway to analyse the open research landscape and invite feedback during an upcoming open consultation. Now, to get a sense of who's in our virtual audience today, I'd like to switch over to a Menti poll. So if you have a device handy, please go to menti.com and you can use that code on the screen to start answering just a few questions. Firstly, we're very interested to hear what you would consider your main role or position to be. That might be as a researcher, as a research support staff. You could be from a funding organisation. Maybe you're a data steward, and so on. So if you can see that on your device, please enter your responses. Yes, the code should be at the top of the screen. So it's 79404960. Right. We obviously have quite a few librarians joining us, some postdocs, researchers, project managers. Program managers, academics. Some research data specialists. Head of research services administrators. That's fantastic to see. Obviously quite a wide range of roles here. And I see we have almost 160 joining, which is great. And obviously, open research and FAIR data are very hot topics at the moment. I think I'll move then to the next question. And that's to get an idea around your discipline or domain. So what areas do you work in terms of the research that you conduct or the research maybe that you support? Health, nutrition, marine, social sciences, all disciplines. Fantastic. You can see open research there as well, which is good. Search data management, music, earth sciences, health science, agriculture. Brilliant. Thanks for your responses there. We'll move to the next question, which is more on the theme of today, and that's on your familiarity with FAIR. So the FAIR principles encapsulating the need for data to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Okay, quite an even spread there, mainly in the middle at the moment. Okay, so hopefully we can offer something for everyone, whether you're very familiar with it and working with data maybe daily, or those who have heard of the concept but don't know much beyond that. Okay, and moving then to the last question just for now, your expectations or main motivations to join this session. So what are you most interested in hearing about? Maybe is it about work in the national context? Is it some area of FAIR data? Is it perhaps something related to work coming out of the FAIRsFAIR project? Question is yet to open. Apologies for that. Okay, I think we've hit a slight roadblock there, so I'm going to move back to the presentation, but maybe you can put some answers into the chat. That would also be useful. So just about your expectations or motivations for this session, just in the chat.
It is open now, Daniel.
It's open now. Okay, good to hear. How to monitor FAIR, FAIR in practice, basic understanding. Very good. NORF, practical examples of FAIR in action. How to apply FAIR, keeping up to date with open research in Ireland. Okay, lots of people to learn, which is great. Examples. Great, I'll keep that running in the background. That's useful information for us, but I'll switch back to the presentation. So today, I'll be giving a short introduction to Ireland's National Open Research Forum and its current focus areas. We'll then be passing to NORF colleagues to talk more about the FAIR data landscape in Ireland. Then we'll be passing over to the FAIRsFAIR project to talk about their work. And specifically, we've chosen a couple of topics to focus on, which are supporting FAIR data through policy enhancement and professionalizing and embedding data stewardship as one of the key concepts for data management. So to start with, some of you may have already be familiar with NORF and others may not. So the National Open Research Forum was established in 2017 to drive the Irish agenda for open research. In its first phase of work, it included developing Ireland's national framework on the transition to an open research environment, which was launched in mid-2019. In its current phase, which runs from last year through to 2022, NORF is focused on development and delivery of a national action plan. And this work is supported by a revised structure whereby we have national working groups in each of the areas that are outlined in the national framework, which are open access to research publications, enabling fair data, infrastructures for open research, skills and competencies, and incentives and rewards. And NORF also operates a steering group and a funders forum, and there's more information about its membership on the NORF website. So today we'll be focusing specifically on fair data. The aim then for this current phase, which runs throughout this year and into the next, is to define nationally coordinated actions for research and researchers in those 5 key areas that I've just explained. And we have basically 3 stages or outputs that we intend to deliver, which are a national open research landscape report, recommendations around implementation, and then a refined and prioritized set of those actions for the action plan. And today is our first broader engagement around the work that's been occurring to develop this landscape report, which is designed to give us an analysis of the broad range of recommendations that sit within the national framework. So this landscape report was developed by the working groups in NORF since late last year until just recently, and it aims to provide a snapshot of the current state of open research in Ireland and give a summary of each of those strategic areas, what progress has been made, and also where the key challenges lie. So if we're to move forward with this transition, what needs to be done or what areas need to be tackled. And we've also attempted to highlight good examples of good practice, both within Ireland and those that sit internationally. I've also linked to a draft version, which we will release for public comment. Today is, I guess, a preview, but at the end of this week, we will be launching a consultation on the landscape report itself. And that will be to gather individual and institutional responses. And we'll be following up via the post-webinar email with those links. So I would encourage everyone who's interested in these topics, open research more generally, to participate in that process and to submit your responses. Again, it represents the first step, but we are looking for early feedback in particular so we capture accurately what's happening at the national level. So having said that, I'd now like to hand over to my colleagues, Aoife Coffey and Tamaya Byro, who are co-chairs of NORF's working group on fair data. And they'll be talking about the findings from the landscape report related to FAIR. Aoife is Research Data Coordinator at University College Cork, where she set up and runs the research data services within UCC Library. She has a background in research with a PhD in plant science and direct hands-on experience with RDM, research data management, from her time with the National Cancer Registry of Ireland. Tamaya Byro is a project manager at the Digital Repository of Ireland. Her work is connected to the DRI's various contributions to the Research Data Alliance, with a current focus on the support that RDA is providing to the European Open Science Cloud.
let me see if I can take over the slides. Let me know if you can see. Okay. Hello, everyone. So, as Daniel said, myself and Aoife, in the upcoming minutes, will try to give you an overview of the section focusing on FAIR in Ireland of the NORF Landscape Report. Let's see. Okay, so as Daniel has mentioned, in driving the open research agenda in Ireland, NORF has set up 5 working groups. One of them is focused on FAIR research outputs. We saw from the Menti that a lot of you are familiar with the concept of the FAIR principles, something that has seen a broad adoption over the last years and has extended a lot more widely to all types of research outputs and also to processes and practices. And that is something that we have tried to reflect in the landscape report that we are sharing with you today. As I mentioned, as mentioned before, the NORF landscape report is now available and will be open for a wider consultation at the end of this week. The section on the FAIR principle brings together perspectives and experience of the FAIR working group, policies and guidelines that have been pushed forward by the research funding organizations and research performing organization in Ireland, data from the skills working group survey, and also the funder survey that has been run in December 2020 and January 2021. Now, when talking about the progress in relation to the FAIR principles, we usually refer to this as a journey, and that's an important thing to highlight from the beginning. So the section in the landscape report that we're presenting a couple of highlights of relates to specific areas relevant to FAIR in connection to the national framework recommendation. So the national framework that Daniel has talked about a few minutes ago. The areas that we have looked at are research data management policies, the research data management planning, RDM skills and training, interoperability, and data citation. You can see on your screens the references to the national framework recommendations that we have connected these areas to. At this point also, it is important to say that FAIR and research data management in Ireland are at an early stage, and there is no national survey providing information on all the stakeholders that are involved in the process. That is a very important information gap, but we do hope that with the open consultation and the various methods that you can contribute through to the report, we might be able to collect the data that is necessary to reflect all the perspectives that are key to the landscaping and planning exercise that is ongoing. To highlight a few of the points of progress towards FAIR in relation to the national framework recommendations, we have adopted a higher level approach, and as I mentioned, we started from the data policies that are available out there, and a key consideration is that several research funding organizations and research performing organizations in Ireland are in the process or have already developed research data management and FAIR policies, and some have incorporated those in their existing policies. Now, it is important to mention that explicit references to FAIR in these policies are only a few, and I think Joy will talk about the importance of explicit and implicit references to FAIR. So, based on the data that we have, actually 6 funding organizations and 6 research performing organizations have such policies undergoing. A good indicator that is discussed in the landscape report is also the growing acknowledgement of the fact that data is seen as a key first-class research output. Many of the policies that are available address all stages of the research data management lifecycle and are trying to be inclusive of all the career stages. But most of them adopt very different approaches, especially in how prescriptive they are, in a sense that some provide very specific recommendations and some are conditions of eligibility, so specific requirements, and others just provide high-level advice. This causes or brings forward issues of fragmentation that sometimes translate at the level of the work of the researchers in very mixed messaging. Some of them have to sort of establish a hierarchy of obligations between the OA policies that they need to address, the research data management policies that they have to answer, or maybe some of the commercial exploitation policies that their organizations have. So there is a mismatch between sometimes the organizational policies versus the funder policies. The same type of fragmentation also can be noticed in relation to the research data management planning. Although DMPs are increasingly mandatory, the approaches in terms of requirements, implementation, and the monitoring are very different. For example, there is no single data management plan template or set of data management templates that are accepted widely by the research funders or the research performing organizations. Consideration also related to the costs of research data management are rarely considered in the policies, and that's something that needs to be addressed more widely. In terms of the skills and the training related to the data management, we noticed that there is an improvement of the coverage of the tasks and responsibilities of data stewardship, yet data stewards are not a common presence and are not embedded necessarily in the research processes. For issues of interoperability, there is a specific section that addresses infrastructure questions in the landscape report. So in our section related to FAIR, we have focused more on the non-technical bits, and the main progress that we've observed relates to leveraging repositories as FAIR enabling infrastructures that provide support to researchers under the form of metadata standards, BIDs, licenses that enable reuse, and occasionally even quality control. Talking about quality, of course, raises also the issue of FAIR metrics. And at the moment in Ireland, there is no formal, unified, or aligned way of assessing research outputs. So there is a particular need for a national definition of the minimum standards related to what we call fairness. And that is one of the lines also that we have encouraged the alignment with other organizations and EU and international efforts. And from that point of view, especially the European Open Science Cloud, but also other open science or data common initiatives that are out there. This is, in a nutshell, the progress that has been detailed in the report in relation to the national framework recommendations. I'm going to pass the floor now to Eva, who's going to talk to us about the key challenges and gaps that have been identified.
Thanks, Tamaya. So we have compiled a list of key challenges and gaps, but we are aware that we had limited time to do so, and maybe have not captured all of them. So, you know, in the landscaping report, please feedback if we don't identify one you feel there is one missing. But I suppose Tamaya has hit on many of these, and this is just a quick summary. So a big gap is the lack of information at all levels, from research funding organizations to research performing organizations to early career stage researchers on their awareness and attitudes to FAIR and research data management in Ireland. And this, I think, is something that we hope is addressed in the future. We definitely see significant lack of alignment of local and national policies with reference to FAIR, and also with international policies as well. As we know, we are part of a wider research community, and aligning data management and data sharing requirements internationally is very important for researchers. And if you're trying to work within a framework which is rife with inconsistencies, it can be quite difficult as a researcher, and it can also be difficult to support researchers in that. There's also a need for greater advocacy and awareness raising around the benefits and reasons why we need more FAIR data and more open data. It's a way of enabling our engagement with EASC and the wider research community, and it's also an indication of the transparency of our research landscape and research integrity as well. It ties in very significantly with that. There's a significant lack of targeted and accredited training programs across the research landscape, not just within Ireland. This is, again, an indication of a wider discussion happening, and something that we need to address for at all levels as well. Training for those who support research data, who are in roles like mine, acting as research data managers or coordinators, but also for researchers themselves to familiarise themselves with the new requirements and regulations required. It is also important that we foster and encourage the development of peer support networks and communities of practice. As much as the information required for FAIR data in terms of metadata and documentation has to come from their grassroots, it has to come from the research communities in how they want their data to be reused and how their data can be made reusable. And we need to encourage this within the Irish research landscape, as they're currently underdeveloped or sometimes entirely absent. Key infrastructure and resources which support FAIR are also underdeveloped at all levels, locally and nationally. And this is another area in which we do need significant development, and it is again an enabler of how we join with the wider research landscape and engage with initiatives such as EASC. But it's not all bad news. There are some good examples of initiatives being taken in the Irish landscape. If you could go on to the next slide there, so Tamaya. So this is just one example, and there are other examples in the larger document. So the HRB developed their research data management policy based on work that took place over the last few years with a pilot that they developed. They brought data stewards they engaged with a group called GoFair, which is active internationally, and they brought representatives from the Irish research landscape on a training week and labelled them as data stewards. And then building on that, they began to develop their research data management policy, which is a really significant policy for researchers to engage with the Health Research Board, and it provides really good guidance with regard to FAIR and open data. They also facilitate researchers in developing data management plans by giving access to the data DMP Online, which is a platform which helps with writing data management plans and gives good guidance on how to comply with the policy, the HRB policy, with regard to research data management. They also give guidance on costs and allow costs associated with research data management and FAIR, which is really significant, because it should be realised that RDM and FAIR don't come for free, and there is sometimes a cost associated with it. In their policy, it's assumed that data is open by default, and if you can't share your data, clear justification must be given as to why it can't be shared. They've also taken a really significant step in that the data management plan is one of the first deliverables from a funded project. So it's not just at application stage, they're pushing it into the research process and really embedding it as part of the research process. So next slide there, Tamaya, please. So this is another example of good practice. Data stewards are pretty rare in the Irish research landscape, although there's a lot of different people who undertake data stewardship activities. So in the Clinical Research Facility in Cork, in their Statistics and Data Analysis unit, they took the initiative to create a service around fair data management and data stewardship. And they provide embedded data stewardship support to patient-focused research. And this is in parallel to their existing study design and statistical support service. So what this means is that they will help researchers from pre-project development and data management plan drafting at application stage, all throughout the project, embedding those research data management and FAIR requirements within the project. And at the end of the project, it allows the production of these high quality, verified research data objects, which are ready to be shared in data repositories and can be cited as a quality output from the research project. So those are just some of the good examples, but there are others in the wider report. Thanks from me. And I also just like to say, can I give a big shout out to the rest of the FAIR working group who put so much work into their section of the NORF report. Only a tiny fraction of it is reflected here in the presentation today, and a slightly larger section is represented in the overall report. But they have done a lot of work in a very short space of time. Thank you. Is there any questions or?
Yes, any burning questions? We're going to have a couple of opportunities to speak about this during the Menti sections. But if there are any questions, we're happy to address them now. I have stopped sharing, so I think if there are no questions.
There's one in the Q&A, it's the role of the data shepherd. Do you mean data steward? I think data steward. So a data steward is somebody who works on research data management within the project. There's lots of different kind of tasks that they can be involved in. I can maybe post some links to descriptions of the data, what a data steward actually is, into the chat. It probably would be a fuller answer, because I could go on forever on what exactly a data steward is. Here.
Martin is also going to provide a little bit more information in later on data stewardship programs and their roles overall. So that will also be another moment when we'll try to provide a little bit more detail to that question.
Just to say, there's a few questions coming into the chat, but if you could use the Q&A function, that will help us better track them. There's one on Horizon Europe, which is a very large topic, but many of the requirements that will be changing are related to research data and the mainstreaming of open science more generally. So this area will definitely become more prominent in the next framework program.
Okay.
So I would suggest maybe we move on.
So you should be able to take over the screen sharing options.
And I'd like to echo also both thanks to Maya and Aoife for their sterling work on this working group, as well as the broader membership. And I would encourage you all to look at the report. There is a 3-page summary, but also the FAIR chapter itself. Now, handing over to our colleagues in FAIRsFAIR. Firstly, I'd like to introduce them both. Arjan Grootveld is head of the project and policy team at DANS in the Netherlands. And DANS is the Dutch National Centre of Expertise and Repository for Research Data. In the FAIRsFAIR project, which is overall coordinated by DANS, Marjan leads the synchronization force, which aims to connect international activities on the journey towards more fair data. And her colleague Joy Davidson is coordinator for the UK's Digital Curation Centre, a research infrastructure that specializes in data management planning, curation, and open science. Joy leads Work Package 3 of the FAIRsFAIR project, which aims to increase the production and use of FAIR data, and she's been involved in reviews for previous S3 roadmaps and several Horizon 2020 research infrastructure funding programs. Thanks very much, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And thanks to the colleagues from the National Open Research Forum we're very pleased that the FAIRsFAIR Roadshow can visit Ireland and collaborate with you. Of course, a national roadshow is a bit of a silly idea in times when we all work online, but okay, let's stick to some of the old metaphors. I'll tell you a bit about the why, who, where, and what of the FAIRsFAIR project. And the why, or in other terms, the objective, is that we foster fair data practices throughout Europe. We want to supply practical solutions for using the fair data principles, because we all know principles are nice, but what happens in practice is in the end what counts. We look at a complete research data life cycle and try to emphasize a fair data culture and the uptake of good practices. So in that context, it's very nice to see that the NORF landscape study contains a lot of good practices, and it's an approach we share. In a more formal way, the objective of the project is to accelerate the realizations of goals of the European Open Science Cloud in all kinds of ways, sharing knowledge through various channels and approaches, as long as it concerns FAIR. Of course, we're not the first to be involved with FAIR. Nearly 3 years ago, there was this report turning FAIR into reality by a high-level expert group. And for us, that is one of the guiding instruments. We'd like to see how much of their recommendations are gradually being implemented and becoming real. About the project, we also have the basic numbers. We started 2 years ago. We recently started our last year. As Daniel said, Dans coordinates the project, but we have in total 6 core partners. We collaborate, of course, with the Digital Curation Center, the European University Association, Trust IT in the communication area, Science and Technology Facilities Council in the UK, and CSC Finland. And these are also our work package leaders. And the broader landscape of the 22 partners is this. You may recognize more of them. We come from 8 membership counted countries in Europe. But it's not just the project partners. We're also very fortunate to have crucial support from what is called the High-Level Advisory Committee. And my colleagues reminded me that I should stress this today, because Patricia Clark from the HRB in Ireland is one of our estimated colleagues in the High-Level Advisory Committee. But we also started what we call the European Group of FAIR Champions. They support us in another way by being a champion in their domain or their profession, and they amplify and apply all things fair that they see fit for their colleagues and networks. So we hope to reach out widely in that way, in addition to the roadshow, of course. The landscape, the where, is even larger. I won't even try to explain the image. You may recognize a lot of logos and images here, probably. On the left-hand side, you see projects like FAIRsFAIR from the same funding call in Horizon 2020. Those are projects we collaborate with very intensively. You also see in the second column the working groups within the European Open Science Cloud. They ended, but of course their work will be succeeded in the new EOSC association. At the right-hand side, you see a couple of so-called horizontal, non-domain specific programs that together build EOSC, and also some clusters which are domain specific in the social sciences, environmental studies, particle physics, and so on, and many, many other FAIR initiatives. And these are the kinds of organizations we hope to collaborate with to some extent and see if we can converge our efforts towards usable tools, information, knowledge, and so on, rather than keeping on diverging, because that would be very confusing for everyone. That's why we have the synchronization force. Last summer, we had a workshop, and we will have another one this spring or before the summer break, where we tried to find out about the progress made on the recommendations from the Turning FAIR into Reality report that I mentioned earlier. And I'm pleased to say that for many of these recommendations, we saw quite some uptake from different European initiatives, projects, working groups. Of course, there were also some recommendations from 2018 that we now recommended to put more effort into, in hope that they will be implemented and taken up as well. But with progress, and as I said, in a couple of months, we will run another workshop of this type, and hopefully we'll see some moving forward since last year. The boring part of any project presentation is the work group, the working group composition. I mention it here nevertheless to illustrate that we have a couple of work packages on data policies and practice. Joy leads one of these work packages. We have overall a lot of activities that focus on repositories and where we collaborate with repositories, in particular where it comes to certification and also the combination of trustworthy repositories that are also supporting FAIR data. And we have 2 work packages in the area of FAIR competencies and FAIR data science curricula. And about those you will hear a little bit more today. Of course, after 2 years, we have a couple of outputs. You will find them in our Zenodo area. And in particular, I'd like to mention 2 tools that we built. The first one, Fuji, measures or helps repositories to measure how fair the data in their holdings are. We sometimes forget when all the efforts we have in making data fair, that there are already lots of data sets around worldwide, and it would be interesting to see how fair and how reusable they actually are. That is what Fuji is for. FAIRsFAIR, on the other hand, is for researchers and data stewards or data supporters in an earlier stage of the data life cycle. When you have a data set and you are preparing it for depositing it in a repository and you want to check if you could make it even more fair. So it's about raising awareness. It's not a formal assessment tool. All these tools, reports, white papers, you find on our website. We also have some support calls, and I think Joy will tell you more about that. We have a lot of web pages. We have the Competence Center, and of course we do have events like participating in this session like today. So have a look at our website if you're curious to learn more. To end with a bit of promotion for one of our upcoming events, on the 13th of April, I think it is a Wednesday off the top of my head, but I'm not sure. The 13th at least, we have a public event in a whole week of FAIRsFAIR activities, and we hope to see you there as well. You can go there and register, but please stay here for now. And at this point, I hand over to Joy, and she'll tell me how to paste the sheets.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Marianne. So I think for the next few minutes, we're going to revert back and have a look at the policy side of things a little bit. So if you can move on to the next slide, I think that would be great. And then just on to the next one again, that'd be perfect. Thank you very much. So just to give you a little bit of background before I go in and share a little bit of the recommendations that we've come up with in FAIRsFAIR about policies, I thought I would just give you a little bit of background into how we came up with these recommendations. Most of this work took place in 2019. We did an awful lot of landscaping analysis, and I think, you know, similar to many colleagues, yourselves included, we've been really trying to get a sense of where we currently are with regards to providing FAIR enablement services. We looked at a number of different consultations. We did 3 in FAIRsFAIR alone, and there were several others in some of the other related projects that Marianne showed in her slide. So in FAIRsFAIR, we had a consultation that looked particularly at policies and practices. This was quite broad brushed. It was aimed at anybody who worked in this kind of ecosystem. So it was funders, it was national level, it was publishers, universities, and other kinds of research performing organizations. It was pretty much open to anyone. We did a similar study that was narrowed down just to HEIs, and that was run by our partners at EUA. But we also did something that was more aimed at the technical side, so looking specifically at semantics and interoperability. And I see there have been a few questions in the chat about interoperability, so we can probably point you to some of these resources as well. So for the FAIR policy landscape analysis, we had an open consultation that ran in the summer of 2019, and we got about 106 responses. They came from all over Europe. And we did get quite a lot that came from the mature countries, so countries including Ireland and the Netherlands and Germany and the UK, but we did get some other responses from countries that were less mature in terms of fair enabling services and policies, and we got some from outside of Europe altogether. It gave a pretty good picture. There was quite a lot of good activity happening, and we have a report, this D3.1 Fair Policy Landscape Report, gives the findings, and we do share some good examples similar to what you've seen in the NORF report. We tried to highlight some examples of good practice, and I think it's probably worth flagging up right now that Ireland actually is one of the examples of good practice. So we certainly see the national efforts here as something that we should be seeing replicated in other countries, because I think taking this approach to try and provide an umbrella for activity at the national level is very important. So we certainly have been flagging up the activity in our reports, showing that Ireland is definitely an example of good practice. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. I'll just start to share just a flavor of some of the recommendations. I won't go into all of them in detail, but I'll give you a flavor of a few. And to flag up here again, this set of recommendations are not directed at any one stakeholder in particular. I think we would encourage all policymakers, whether you're at the funding level, at the university level, to consider how these might relate to you. So the first one is, we think there's a need to agree on a common set of fair policy elements to describe policies. And I think, you know, this is, as we particularly start to think about monitoring open science policies, we need to move away from just the fact that an open science policy exists in a country or at an organization, because it's really what we need to know is what's in the policy, what is covered by that policy. And to help us to do that in our landscape analysis, we came up with a structured approach to looking at policies, and we had a very long list, 42 elements that we looked at. But it did help us to kind of compare and contrast the policies of, you know, a particular stakeholder group and also across different stakeholder groups. So I think one of the key things we'd really like to see is more common efforts to try and do this collaboratively. So if we can get funders across Europe to think what kinds of things should be in funders' open science policies, for example, similarly for your universities, can we agree on what should be covered in these, and then start to make sure that we can do that in a more structured way. The other thing that we noticed with our recommendations is that there's definitely a need to improve machine readability of the policies themselves. So if we're looking to try and generate more machine automated pipelines, so I think, again, looking at data management planning tools as an example, ideally we'd be able to feed in policies from one end and make sure that we can be informed about what has to happen and have this stuff happen in a more dynamic way. To do this, we really do have to have machine readable policies. So that is another area where we really definitely think there needs to be some work. I think the strategic research and innovation agenda document, I'm not sure how many people are aware of it, but certainly I think most of us on the speakers panel have been working with this quite closely. One of the recommendations they have in relation to the European Open Science Cloud is that there is this need to monitor standardized national open science policies. And again, this means that we should have some sort of harmonization and consistency across the policies. And I think if we can move towards that, it will help to mitigate one of the risks that Timea mentioned, which was the risk of mixed messages across different policies, both within an organization and across different stakeholders. So the more alignment we can get, hopefully the more commonality and the less confusion we can start to see. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. All right, the next one that we picked up on here is that when we looked at the different policies in our landscape analysis, it became very difficult in some cases to kind of discern what is a rule versus what is just an actual nice thing to do or a recommended practice. So I think there's definitely a need to start to emphasize being clearer about what the rules are and making them much more unambiguous, and then, you know, supporting more of the nice to-dos and being able to help people to make that clear distinction between what they have to do and what is just recommended that they do. And again, I think machine readability will be quite important for this. If we are looking to have machine readability, then distinguishing between rules and things that are not rules will be pretty crucial. So that is one of the things, again, that we think definitely should be addressed as part of a community effort. The other thing that we found was that policies are really quite difficult to find in a kind of consistent way. A lot of people have web pages where there are texts listed on the web page, and it's a mix of actual policy elements with guidance. So it can be quite difficult, again, to pick through what the policy is versus what is the guidance around it. And there's not a lot of long-term sustainability about these policies. If it's just a web page, they can disappear, they can be replaced with new versions, and it's not always clear that this has happened. So if you're trying to get a sense of what policy you might have been working under 2 years ago, if there's been an update, it may not be very easy to find that. And I think, you know, that is why we're recommending that policies themselves should be curated. We should have a persistent identifier assigned to clearly versioned policies, and these should be made in publicly accessible registries so that they are available to anybody who needs to find them. So those are two things, again, that we think definitely have to be addressed as a community. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. This is the reference that Timea made earlier about FAIR being referenced in policies. So when we looked at the different policies, we found that there was some references to FAIR specifically. Quite often they were in the funders' policies. But in most of the other policies we looked at, whether it was publishers or universities' policies, there was pretty much most of the FAIR principles were covered implicitly. So they weren't specifically saying this is fair, but it was covering all of the right bits of information. We're not saying that there's a right or a wrong way to do this. In our recommendation, we're happy to say that FAIR can be referred to in both ways. I think it really depends on the organization and what your aims are. You know, if we see in Ireland that the national move is that there is a real huge emphasis being placed on FAIR, then it might be something that your organization wants to do to reflect compliance with the national approach. What we found when we did some interviews with some of the publishers was that even where there were implicit references to FAIR, some of the publishers had no intention of ever, or at least not in the short term anyway, making a reference to FAIR specifically. And the reason for that was because they thought it was still quite a new concept for researchers, and they didn't want to introduce terminology into their policies that might cause greater confusion. So I think, you know, it's really going to be dependent on your own aims to understand how much of an emphasis you want to put on FAIR, whether it's explicit or implicit. I think the other thing that Timea picked up on is that there's different levels of prescriptiveness associated with FAIR, and some people will tell you exactly what you need to do for each of the FAIR principles. Others will be a lot less prescriptive and just give you some general guidelines. With funders, quite often there is a little bit of a vagueness with some of the requirements, and I think that is often done to allow organizations to have a little bit of wiggle room to be able to adapt and interpret the policy to provide their own response to it. So there's, you know, pros and cons between having a really descriptive level versus a really kind of vague level. Both have their pros, but I think it's going to be up to us as a community to, even if we're just having implicit references to FAIR, to make sure that we're covering things and making clear what we expect from researchers. And I think, you know, we heard also in the earlier presentations that researchers are very confused by all of this stuff. So the more we can do to take away the ambiguity and the confusing terms, the better. So I think always think about who the end reader is going to be and what we expect them to do when coming up with your policies. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we have recommended as well is that there's been some good work at coming up with better descriptions. And I think, you know, we heard earlier the HRB policy. I think certainly we would say that is a very good example of how to be clear about what is expected and what sorts of outputs have to be considered when you're making data fair. And I think it's very good to see that the HRB policy makes clear that it's not just data sets. It could be software, it could be models, it could be a range of different things. And I think that sort of level of definition has to be made clear to researchers, just so that they understand it's not just publications, it's not just data sets, it can be really a very wide range of outputs. And it's really up to them to think about what they are producing and how they want to keep or not some of these things beyond the life of the project. I think in addition to being clear on the range of outputs that need to be considered, we also need to have a little bit more discussions on how long we expect these outputs to be retained for. Most funders will expect data to be made available for a set number of years, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years after the life of the project. Some funders, for example, in the UK, have very vague wording, and it could mean that you're expected to keep data available in perpetuity. So I think there's a little bit more that we have to do to make clear not only the kinds of things we expect people to keep, but also how long we're going to expect them to be kept for. And as Aoife said, there's cost implications for these as well. In terms of, you know, this recommendation, one of the things we're looking to try and do collaboratively with the policymakers, but with the research communities definitely, is to decide what is fair enough. There is no kind of switch they can flick that something is either fair or it's not. It's various kind of stages of gray in between. It's a journey, as we keep saying. So there's lots of things you can do to improve the fairness of your outputs. And deciding how much is enough is something that really has to be done by the researchers, and hopefully in a supported way through data stewards and some guidance and support. But there's no single answer that you can say as to what would make something fair enough. We need to try and come up with these definitions in a loose way with the research community. So there's lots of conversations that we still need to have. I think Science Europe is doing a good way, a good bit of work on this and thinking about domain data protocols, and the Go Fair, fair implementation profiles are also examples of how this is being fleshed out, but this is very much a work in progress. And we need to be aware of these in the policies that we're putting forward. So we can move on to the next slide, please. One of the things I think we noticed and we're very happy to see in our policy analysis was that most policies, especially from the funders, were very clear that they expect as much of the outputs that they fund to be made available publicly, but they know that not everything can be shared. So this notion that research data and associated output should be as open as possible, but as close as necessary, as we see with the commission sort of terminology. This is definitely something we saw reflected across the board with most of the funders. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to be able to support this a little bit more in a practical sense. So if we're saying in the policies that you don't have to share everything, what we do want to make sure is that even if something can't be shared, at least the metadata can be shared so that people know it exists and they know how to go about asking for access if they are indeed a legitimate user. So what we'd like to see is more work, and this is probably less policy, more in associated guidance, but more to try and come up with a set of kind of standardized data availability statements, and I've included on the slide here, this is something from the University of Manchester. They provide this where it gives people a set of, openly available data statements to choose from. The idea is that people working at the university can come and take some of these statements and just drop them into the text of their paper if they have to provide a data availability statement. But conversely, we should start to think about how this might be built into the metadata of the repositories. So where the data sets will go to live, that underpin the published findings, we need to make sure that we can get this information into the repository descriptions as well, so that people who come and find the data will know that the data is not here for a good reason, and they understand why, and they know how they can go about asking for access. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. This is a recommendation around data management planning. So as we've heard before, many universities, many research performing organizations across the board, funders, and in some cases, very few, but some publishers are encouraging data management plans. As we've heard already, there's a lot of different ways that people are doing this. Some want them at the start, at the grant application stage. Some are looking for them as deliverables within the first 6 months. And the European Commission and I think HRB are good examples here. What we'd like to see is a little bit more convergence around this. So I think the fact is that across the board, everybody thinks data management planning is a good idea, and it helps you to identify risks and issues that you need to consider before you start your work and before you encounter challenges. So it's good practice, and it helps to support research integrity and all of the other things that researchers are caring about. So if we can get greater consistency on when DMPs are required over the life cycle, I think that will help researchers quite a lot. So ideally, we would like to see that there is something at the start of a project, an outline plan that leads maybe to the first deliverable and several updates over the course of the research life cycle. But ideally, we'd really like to see moving towards an end stage data management plan. The reason for this is that everything up to that point is a plan. It's an intention to do something. What we need to do is to kind of move away from the intention to then saying, well, what actually happened? And if we can start to look at the end stage data management plans as sort of hubs of information, if you like, you could start to see how you could maybe include things like persistent identifiers to various outputs that are being retained. And it's just kind of closing that circle from the planned activity and showing you the evidence base. And I think as funders and people looking to kind of do monitoring of how things are happening in the real world, I think these kind of approaches will be an important tool to try and consider how we get the evidence that people have shared data in line with what we're expecting. I think the point we've made here is that there are some monitoring activities going on. Some of the funders are looking at this. It's not entirely consistent yet. We're seeing a lot of good things with things like the DORA declaration, the lead-in manifesto, and a real move towards not just looking at research publications and trying to reward open science as part of good practice. It's not consistent yet. I think hopefully the Irish work with NORF is certainly going to be looking at some of these things, and I think there's potential for you to take a lead on this. But definitely we need to see more consistency here, and we're very much kind of saying that we should be rewarding good practice. At some point we may need to consider, do you bring in penalties for non-compliance? That opens up a whole other can of worms, because then you really have to do more than dipstick monitoring of compliance to really understand, are people not doing something, and what sorts of things would you then consider doing if people aren't complying? But these are questions that we will have to consider as we progress down the maturity of this whole ecosystem. So some questions about monitoring. It's a tricky thing. It can be very time consuming and resource intensive to do, but we'll have to consider collectively how we do this between the various stakeholders. So if we can move on to the last slide, I think. Oh, second to last slide. Yes, sorry, I know I'm a few seconds over. I hope we'll get a little bit of time for the coffee break. Just to say that in our landscape assessment, we found that one of the great motivators or enablers is having local support. So we found that that was deemed to be very, very positive in terms of getting researchers to change their behavior if they knew that they had somebody locally that they could go to get support. We know that not everybody is in the fortunate position to have data stewards. We heard earlier that they're kind of few and far between, but there are lots of different ways to get support. So I think there are different models where people are pooling support across institutions, and I think there's lots of ways to start to think about this. Last point here is the monitoring of compliance. It's not always easy to do, as I mentioned, and it's not always popular. People don't necessarily like to be judged. So before you start thinking about monitoring compliance, it's important to think about what you're going to monitor, and more importantly, why, so that it's not just gathering information for the sake of it. So think about that before you start to commit to anything. And then just the last slide, please. And this is just to say that we have got a FAIRsFAIR policy support program. We will be doing some work with NORF over the coming months to take that forward. And we will, as a result of having this policy support program, we will come out with some guides and some webinars and things that will help us to do things in a little bit more practical sense. So I think I'll stop there. I know I've run over about 5 minutes, so apologies for that. And I hand back to Daniel, I think.
I will actually pick this up and try to share the Menti. Unless, Daniel, do you want to, maybe there are a couple of questions, I think, for Joy. Do you want to take them on now, Joy?
I think maybe skip to the Menti, and some of those, maybe Mayan as well, if there are those that you can answer by writing.
Okay, brilliant. A lot of the topics that you've already addressed, Joy, hopefully will come up also in the Menti. So feel free to jump in and add anything to that. We're using the same code as before. We have a couple of questions, mostly related to policy development and enhancements and FAIR enablers. So if you can go to Menti and use the code, I hope someone can, you can see it at the top of your screen, but maybe someone else can put it also in the chat. So we would like to know if your organization has a FAIR or a research data management policy, if it's currently implemented, if it's in phase of development, so there is a draft policy and it's going through internal review, if it's in early planning stages, no policy text yet, but there are several discussions underway addressing different aspects related to that. I see that already there are a few answers from people that say that they do not have any FAIR or research data management policy or activity at the moment, and a lot of you have answered that they don't know, which is obviously an important indicator, because policies are supposed to guide the various activities. So the fact that this is not widely known is also a point, and maybe a future direction of activity should be around awareness raising. So 15, I see 15 out of the 50 answers that we have say that they have a policy currently implemented. 7 is in development, 7 at early stages, 10 they don't have such a policy at the moment, and the number of I don't know has gone up. This is very important information. As we said previously, one of the things that have come out of when doing the landscape exercise was that there is no actual source of data or complete survey of the landscape in terms of policies and practices that would serve such an analysis. So the data, your answers are very important. Okay, sorry, I thought, Joy, you were raising your hand.
So Just to say, I think the fact that there's quite a high level of people who don't know, I don't think that's unusual. I think there's a lot of work that we all have to do at our own organizations to make sure people are aware of the policies and what they mean.
Absolutely, and there's also, as we said, there's a little bit of sometimes there is a conflict if the policies have not been developed in alignment. There is a conflict regarding which of the policies should be considered. I will move on to the next question. So what were or do you foresee to be the biggest challenges in implementing FAIR-related policies? The landscape report has addressed or has tried to gather information on this, just to understand if I'm hoping that the question is open, so there are no. Do let me know if by any chance you cannot answer and we have the same problem as previously. But as I was mentioning, the landscape report has has looked into gaps and areas that need to be addressed. And Daniel mentioned that in the next phase we will try to look at preliminary recommendations and try to identify these challenges and gaps. So ensuring that researchers understand FAIR and can comply, yes, awareness issues, understanding and supporting infrastructure and capacity, resources, buy-in, a lack of understanding of the necessity, yes, bureaucracy often will scare the researchers, yes, so it needs to be a lean process that makes sense to them, and the benefits of making their data fair should be obvious. Costs in both time and data storage resources, persuading stakeholders of the benefits of FAIR, yes, so again, awareness raising issue, extra work, extra cost, lack of expertise, yes, that in a nutshell, these are quite a few challenges. Resources, the necessary staff, yes, bottom-up time, bottom-up pile with regard to importance, resources, management appetite, complexity due to the data protection demands, expertise, resources. So these are it's a long set of challenges. Researchers' behavior and institutional support, these go hand in hand. Data catalog development, data management best practices, knowledge and implementation, monitoring of compliance. Yes, we did mention that in the landscape report that policies have different levels of requirement, monitoring and compliance, so that there is a need for alignment, time and buy-in, volume of data, buy-in and training, long-term storage of data, lack of institutional knowledge, buy-in from senior management and by researchers, financial and personnel support, data security insurance, extra resources and costs. Thank you for all these answers. We're gonna collect them, and this is very valuable feedback for the landscape report. Please also follow the links that Daniel has shared, and keep an eye out for when the open consultation will be published. We welcome all this feedback, and we'll try to feed the input into the report. I'll move on to the next question. Joy has also said that FAIR is a journey, and there are different aspects to what is fair enough. So we would like to know from you if you have implemented or are engaged with any of the following FAIR enablers. And we have seen DMPs mentioned, PIDs, so persistent identifiers, metadata standard, the use of certified repositories, licenses enabling reuse, semantic interoperability, so semantic vocabularies, working with data stewards, FAIR metrics. So all of these are aspects related to FAIR, and we would like to know how familiar you are with this, and how these, if they have been implemented in your organization and in your work, how does that image look like? If I think I'm not sure. I thought you were trying to unmute. Please feel free to join in. if you have anything, if you would have anything in addition to add to this. The report, the landscape report, is trying to cover a lot of these aspects, but obviously there are levels of detail that need to be addressed, and the different participants to the entire process have different levels of familiarity with all of these aspects. So thank you. I see that a lot of the MPs are one of the enablers that people have engaged most with. The use of certified repositories, as we said, that has been identified as one of the key enablers. Licenses that would enable reuse, metadata standards. FAIR metrics is quite low in terms of use and engagement with. All the others working with data stewards and PIDs seem to be at the same level. So I will stop at this point. I think the next question will be in relation to the data stewards, and that we'll touch upon that after Marianne's presentation. Thank you already for the answers that you're providing with that. I don't know if there are additional questions, maybe some that have come through the Q&A that relate to policies that we should be addressing now, or should I pass on to Marianne? Daniel, have you noticed?
I think we can move on. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
So Marianne, thank you.
Thank you. And I'll share the screen again. All right, as promised, a bit on data stewardship and what we think about professionalizing their way of working. Basically, I want to address 3 topics. What we think is a data steward. There was a question about that, and Eva would also had also some definitions. In FAIRsFAIR, we have a definition that I'll share with you. Typically, we think they have a very important role when we talk about making and using fair and open data and other research outputs eventually. So we see them as professionals. And one area where we think they are where they are essential is in helping researchers and other stakeholders in data management to increase awareness about what FAIR is and what it isn't. So hence these 3 issues. What do data stewards do? Well, they do a lot. In FAIRsFAIR, we define data stewards as support staff from research communities or research libraries usually. And there are also data stewards who manage data repositories. Can be combined, often it isn't. It's a definition I took from our deliverable 3.4 with recommendations on practice to support the principles, and that is typically what data stewards do. You're happy to use the more generic term data support staff, and this is for me the moment where I should say I'm actually wearing 2 hats today, the FAIRsFAIR hat and also the hat as a DANS member of the Dutch research community and research support community. Because we have, since 2018, a training on data management, which is called Essentials for Data Supporters, because we wanted to avoid the discussion about all these job titles of people who support data and data management in one or another way. So, but here we focus on data stewards, and it makes sense to distinguish between, let's say, 3 flavors of data stewards, although they overlap. Some data stewards who are more aligned perhaps with data scientists are really embedded in projects and in smaller departments within a university, for instance. Other data stewards primarily have a more generic and advisory role, and you often find them in the library. And then there is a third flavor, more concerned with policy development, data policies, the strategy of an organization, how to become more fair enabling and coordinating activities like granting data management plan support and so on. We used this three-way split. The image on the right-hand side I took from a couple of Dutch reports. LCRDM is the National Coordination Point Research Data Management in the Netherlands. They run a couple of projects also trying to find out what data stewardship is in practice, and they came up with the same three flavors. We're not the only ones, by the way, but it's good to see some convergence. All these activities that data stewards do in their professional life have to do with or depend in a sense on support and tooling and training, skills development. And in FAIRsFAIR, our activities to help there and to provide help are scattered across the work packages. We work on tools and support. I mentioned some tools already. We have work packages devoted to FAIR in higher education to help the next generation of researchers and professionals to acquire more FAIR knowledge and skills. And we do also training, which could be more ad hoc, but for which we also have or are developing an exchange platform to help the trainings and provide some working space for those who participate in trainings. I will focus on a couple of examples. First, let's have some trainings. In 2019, we were very lucky to collaborate with the existing CoData RDA Research Data Science Summer School, which is focused on early career researchers. And what we did together was come up with a 2-week program, curriculum. In the first week, early career researchers and early career data stewards sat together, worked together. And in the second week, they split, and we, from FAIRsFAIR, so to speak, focused on the data stewards. And that helped them to get the various perspectives, to get a good feeling, if they hadn't already, about what early career researchers need in terms of data management support, but also to learn a bit more about that for their support role. We also do train-the-trainer events. Joy was one of the colleagues involved in some trainings delivered end of last year at Manchester University and also for Costa Rica. And these host organizations were provided with a list of topics we could help them with. They selected what was relevant for them. Of course, it was delivered online, and I understood that was a bit of a challenge, and I think it is a challenge for everyone who is involved in face-to-face trainings, and last year had to change that into online trainings or courses. The FAIRsFAIR Data Forum that we are developing was used for discussion, but also to share materials, because the approach taken was not so much a tutor in front of a class, which is basically a session like today, but more asking from participants to study available materials by themselves and then use the contact time to discuss and ask questions, find answers, and so on. That was a bit of the extra work you do when you organize train-the-trainer events, of course, not just repeating what you plan to do on Zoom. That was training, which is usually more informal. We also have the ambition to come up with a curriculum, which is more formal. And the colleagues in that relevant work package went through a survey, which Joy already introduced, and also some focus groups, working to come up with support both for the bachelor and master and doctoral levels. They looked at existing so-called competence frameworks from other initiatives that look at skills, competence, learning outcomes, approaches for inspiration, and see what we could use in the FAIRsFAIR context. That led to another deliverable, and recently, last month, there was a third deliverable focusing this time on the FAIR competence framework for higher education. Part of what you will find in that deliverable is an analysis of job profiles, because we looked at the job market and see what kind of skills or competence are typically asked when there is a vacancy for data stewardship related function. The work that FAIRsFAIR does is in collaboration with and strongly building on what was done in the Edison project. You may have heard of that. I think one of the strong points of Edison is that it's not just for academic data supporters, but also for data stewardship within the private sector. So it makes sense to see where the commonalities are. The next step will be to translate, in a way, this competence framework, which is a report now, into a handbook that universities can use to introduce more fair competence content in their curriculum and in their courses. So FAIRsFAIR will come up with model curricula and learning materials. And already quite soon, in 2 months' time, there is a pair of workshops, I think it's 2 mornings, end of May, targeting at people who are involved in doctoral research education programs about how to deal with these fair data competences in their doctoral education programs. So you may want to take a look if you're interested in, or involved in organizing that kind of training at that level. All this information from FAIRsFAIR is, I would almost say by definition, domain discipline, sorry, what's the word? It's generic, it's not domain specific. And that may mean that sometimes it's a bit high level. So I thought I should also introduce a bit about what we've done in the Netherlands. That's my Dutch hat I now put on. Because we recently delivered a study which was requested from the National Program on Open Science. They run a couple of projects, and this one focused on professionalizing data stewardship in the Netherlands, with the focus on competences, training and education from a couple of angles. What does the current training and education landscape for data stewards look like? And we had 8 case studies from universities, university medical centers, and universities of applied sciences. Another angle was job profiles. What does a data steward do, and how can we describe it formally? When you see ×3, unfortunately, although we are a small country, the universities for applied sciences and university medical centers each have their own job classification system. So, okay, no convergence there, but there is collaboration. And we also looked at job profile components for research software engineers. They are not data stewards, but we see that they tend to collaborate with data stewards in organizations that have both these job types. So we thought it made sense to support that kind of collaboration. And the third angle was looking at existing trainings and also certification, if any, of education and training. To give you an example of what case studies look like, this one was produced by a data steward working at Erasmus Medical Center, that is related to Erasmus University in Rotterdam. You see, for instance, at the bottom that special topics for this data steward are advising on data management plans, on metadata and archiving, and developing workshops to raise data management planning awareness. You can also see at the right-hand side, where it comes to training for data stewards, so not by, but for, there is no formal learning trajectory for data stewards at this medical center. So what do they do? There is, of course, learning on the job. They collaborate with other data stewards, both at the medical center and at university level, and they participate in interest groups and so on. So this is definitely not the ideal situation. It works, I think it works well. This data steward is much appreciated by colleagues and researchers. but this is not what you hope for when you talk about professionalizing in a professional way. So we had a couple of these case studies to confirm the urgency of this kind of project. Jumping to the main recommendations from the project, findable in the report, we recommend at a national level to define data stewardship competencies. So what should you be able to do in terms of knowledge and skills, and to formalize the job profiles, which in turn will lead probably to more formalized job openings descriptions. We also recommend to define, develop, and deliver training programs that match these competencies, but there is a clear order, of course, in these two recommendations. And what we explored with to some extent, but also recommend, is to build a skills tool for data stewards or their employers as one point of reference where information about competences, learning goals, job profiles, available trainings comes together, allows people to self-assess their level of skills and competences, but also to get an idea about potential career development, which then hopefully connects to being rewarded and those ideals. We have a kind of a hidden agenda, and I think that resonates with what Joy mentioned, as it should be more standardized, because it is not hidden, but it's underlying. We really hope that these stakeholders who together commanded this project will really work together to implement some of the recommendations. So the umbrella organization of the universities and not individual universities, for instance. The research funders together with the universities and publishers potentially even, but not everyone by themselves as we typically do. Okay, this was a C also. There is another C also. There is more on this if you're interested in this professionalization work and modeling that work. There is an interest group in the Research Data Alliance about this topic. Then I'll jump to the last point, the awareness. Eva mentioned it, that there is some need for a greater advocacy and awareness raising around fair and open data. We found that in one of the surveys we did, there was a question about who would have the most awareness, so to speak, about what FAIR principles mean. And there was a clear majority in blue and orange in the top image that said, well, this awareness is highest among the professional and support staff. It is somewhere in the middle with researchers, and with students, it's hardly there. A related question, or the answers to it, you can find in the recent State of Open Data, where they asked the question how familiar you as a respondent are with the FAIR principles. And you see in 3 successive surveys, 2018, 19, and 20, that the gray bars, the most recent responses, are fortunately the longest, so the familiarity is increasing, but it's still in the range of 25% only. So there is something to do. I mentioned a tool that hopefully helps to increase those percentages. It's for researchers and data stewards. It's educational. It is not very strict. And it contains 10 questions with tips and a lot of information to improve your data fairness before you deposit a data set in a repository. I invite you to explore it and play with it for a while, but for now I just give some screenshots. These are questions that the tools asks. So are you aware, they all start with, are you aware? Are you aware, for instance, that a data set should be assigned a globally unique, persistent and resolvable identifier when deposited with the data repository? You can answer yes or no. You can use the I information icon, and then you get a lot of information with pointers outside the tool. Maybe too much, but like we said, we want to raise awareness, and you can close the window if you don't like it anymore. As you walk through the tool and you answer the questions, You may say yes or no, but you're also being asked to what degree you intend to comply with what is expected of you. This is a bit of my personal assessment. So I answered for some questions pretty likely and for others very unlikely that I intend to comply. And in the end, after those 10 questions, you get 2 scores about your FAIR awareness, but also about your willingness to comply. Interestingly, it was this functionality to also score for willingness to comply was implemented because that came out of user studies. So there you have it. And with the awareness, or perhaps the missing awareness, you get some guidance on the areas where your awareness level was not very high. I'll stop here and see if there are any questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I think we can switch over then to the mentee if there are no questions at the moment. Do we have a question running already?
Thanks, Marianne. Aoife here again. So these are questions that I'm really interested in. We don't really know much about data stewards or data stewardship within the Irish landscape, and we have this feeling that it's relatively new, or that there are many people who maybe are engaged in data stewardship activities, but may not label themselves as data stewards. They have other job titles and they're kind of, you know, double jobbing or are taking on some of those kind of data management activities within a research group. This is really interesting. And thank you so much for participating and your answers. So far we have, yes, we have data stewards, and we've got 9 answers there, which is really interesting. And then we have support structures similar to data stewards, but not acknowledged as such. So the kind of middle ground, which I think would be, you know, something that is definitely developing maybe in the libraries or in research support services in response to funder requests to data management plans. And then 17 answers saying no, they don't, but hope to have them, which is interesting. Tamaya, I think you can move on to the next question there. So our next question is, how could data stewardship be further supported in Ireland? Rank the following in order of priority. And the answers we have is define data stewardship competencies and formalize job profiles. Define, develop and deliver tailored training programs to match the required competencies. Analyze local data stewardship case studies to clarify the needs of data stewards of your organization. Collaborate locally, nationally in organizing training, and create a data stewardship skills tool as a single point of reference for data stewardship competencies, training and education. So we're looking forward to seeing what you think of those and how we should begin to prioritize these. Because it's a tricky landscape, it's a relatively new role. A lot of work has gone in Europe, but we can hear from Marianne's very interesting presentation that they haven't got it all sorted yet either. So good to hear we're not so far behind, I guess. Okay, so what's rising to the top? So in first place, we have define, develop and deliver tailored training programs. Oh, it's been knocked off the top. Competencies and job profiles. I think that's really important because if we want it as a professional role, there does need to be a clear career pathway for people who engage in data stewardship. Very interesting, very interesting. Okay, I think we can move on to the next question. So what, in your view, is the key role of a data steward? Please rank the various options. And these are based on the roles identified in the report Marianne was involved in. So we've got that idea of an embedded data steward working very closely within a research project. They maybe have a disciplinary background, so they're, you know, have some training in that discipline and are able to really engage with the research data. Then you've got people like me, so I'm based in the library. I provide more kind of generic and advisory service. And then you've got policy, strategy, and coordination. Again, that's something that I engage with, and it's quite important, you know, to try and align the policies that we know are inconsistent at the moment within our landscape. So, you know, I think, but maybe it can be difficult then for data stewards to be a sort of jack of all trades. You know, there needs to be some specialization as well, would be my view. So we see we've got more answers for the operational embedded data stewardship type role, but it's very close. Just have a look at the comments here. This is a comment here on funders and the importance of the requirements of funders for data management plans and data stewards, which is interesting. I think funders have taken the initiative and given us the push to develop these services, but that's maybe not sustainable, that we need to think internally within our institutions and nationally as a research community as how we take it to the next step. I don't know what people think on that point. Okay, I think that's our last question. Daniel, do you want to, or it's, I've lost track of our agenda now. I think it's you next.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. I'll switch back to sharing the screen. And I'd invite the audience, just as we go through these last few slides, we likely have time for a few questions if there's anything on any of the presentations and topics that you've heard today, to put those into the Q&A. So the next part is just some takeaways, some actions and summaries. From FAIRsFAIR, I wonder if Marianne or Joy would like to just speak to this.
I can pick this up. Just a couple of things to point out. So Marianne mentioned the FAIR tool. That's freely available. It's a really good kind of 10 basic questions, helps people to understand their understanding of FAIR. It's pitched towards researchers, but I think it's equally useful for those who find themselves in data steward-like roles, just to get a sense of what you might need to be aware of, and to think if you don't have the answers, where you might start to pool your knowledge across your peers and try to get some guidance. So have a look at the FAIR tool and play around with it. As I mentioned, we are just embarking on a policy support program. We're just in the middle of setting that up. We have been in discussion with NORF about how we can do something specific for this group. So we will continue those discussions and share information when it's ready. And the last one is just again to flag up, we have a week-long event coming up in mid-April, which is on more parts of the FAIRsFAIR project. So if there's other things, particularly maybe around the semantics and interoperability that we didn't get a chance to talk about today, by all means, register for the public workshops. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Joy. And just a few other messages from NORF. As you can see, there's a lot of work going on in this area, and it's fantastic to see also at the national level, Marianne talking about the roadmap in the Netherlands, which is an example that we've also highlighted in the report. So there's a few opportunities to continue engagement with NORF. The first is the upcoming consultation around the landscape report. There's various avenues to provide feedback. So we've made the document available via a public Google document, and the most direct way is just to add a comment on anything you would like to highlight or question, or maybe have additional perspectives to bring to what's already been documented. Secondly, there will be a form in which individuals or institutions can provide open feedback, as well as some answers to some more structured questions. And thirdly, you can also email me directly to provide feedback that way. So that will be open until the end of April, and we intend to then publish a final version of the report in May. In parallel, there'll be other work going on, so we're trying to move towards how do we tackle those challenges in the Irish context, how do we actually develop actions, and in tandem with that work, we also want to reach out for more targeted consultation, especially among specific groups that might be affected in terms of arts and humanities researchers, early career researchers, and others that have already in the initial phase of NORF been identified. So that will continue throughout the year, but this is an opportunity just to show at a broad view where Ireland is sitting, and to have some basis for that conversation to continue. So I've left some contact details there as well, and I want to highlight the next webinar, which will be coming up at the end of the month. So we've spaced these roughly 2 weeks apart, and in the next one we'll be tackling another very large topic with a similar format, looking at the findings from the working group on research infrastructures. And we'll also be getting international perspectives on developments in the European Open Science Cloud from Sarah Jones at Giant, on disciplinary infrastructures, especially for the social sciences and humanities from Sally Chambers, and a view on, I guess, what you might call core scholarly infrastructures and how to make these sustainable from Jeffrey Builder at Crossref. And we would invite you to register. That registration is open, and we'll also send all of those links in the next few days as a follow-up to the webinar. I think we can close the webinar there. Thank you all for participating. It's great to see so much interest, and I hope you'll be attending the future events organised. And once again, thank you to all our speakers.